Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for showing up early enough for my presentation. My name is Everham. I just celebrated my 20th year in Southwest Florida and at FGCU, so I'm really happy to be here today. My talk this morning is meant to be a little bit of ecology and a little bit of philosophy, and I get to quote Aldo Leopold, I think at least 3 times. As a way of introduction of who I am, I stole this from one of my colleagues. I recommend using it sometime for a talk to try to show who you are as a professional. What I did in this case was take the titles of all the papers I've published and put it into Wordle and had a word cloud generated that sort of showed the kind of scientist that I am. It shows my history of working on the impacts of hurricanes in the Caribbean, particularly in Puerto Rico, looking at forest impacts. And right in the middle, you can see the word disturbance. I sometimes talk about myself as a disturbance ecologist. Since coming to Southwest Florida, I've continued to work on hurricanes. I've also expanded into fire, frost, floods, invasive exotics, and human activities, including looking at restoration as a disturbance event. And so I don't want all of you who are doing marvelous restoration work to imply or to think that I'm implying that it's bad. It's just that when we put our hands into an ecosystem, it changes in interesting ways. All of my research is about change, and that's what I'll be talking about today. Okay, that's me. So let's focus on all of you guys for a minute. Would you please cooperate with me and close your eyes? Serious, close your eyes. All right. Now visualize a place that you manage or that you care about. Could even be your backyard. But try to visualize a place that you think is right, that's being managed as we think it should be. Picture that place. Look around. Enjoy it. We don't spend enough time celebrating our success. Now consider why you think this place is right. Does it have to do with fewer exotics? Does it have to do with getting the water right? Those are 2 things that Lisa just said a minute ago. Does it have to do with the diversity you see on that landscape? Does it have to do with your vision of it being like it used to be? Does the place that you're looking at in your mind right now have integrity? And what does that mean? So go ahead and open your eyes if you haven't already. I saw a lot of people open their eyes even when I told you couldn't. Don't do that again. My happy place is in the Fakahatchee. And I want to look at this idea of integrity. So one way of defining ecosystem integrity is intactness, which I think refers to the way it used to be. Completeness, which probably has something to do with diversity. And integration, which probably has something to do with the ecological function, all things that we have to deal with. And then the concept of ecological integrity is multifactorial. It can involve a lot of other things. So look at that list. I'm not going to go all down it. If you think your job is to ensure the ecological integrity of the lands that you managed, crap, you guys have a hard job. There's a lot of things that you have to do to be able to do that. So let's simplify that and go back to Aldo Leopold from the land ethic. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise. I love Aldo Leopold. He might be wrong in part in that, in focusing on the idea of stability. Some emerging ideas in the science of ecology are presented in these 2 somewhat recent texts. Rosenberg's Win-Win Ecology was published over a decade ago, and in that he explores an idea called reconciliation ecology. And it's defined this way: the science of inventing, establishing, and maintaining new habitats to conserve species diversity in places where people live, work, and play. And then more recently, in 2013, Hobbs, Higgs, and Hall published this text, Novel Ecosystems Intervening in the New Ecological World Order. It's an interesting title. It sounds a little scary to me, but it's an interesting title. They start out their book with this quote from the artist Aldo Gottlieb. Certain people always say we should go back to nature. I notice that they never say we should go forward to nature. It seems to me they're more concerned that we should go back than about nature. It's an interesting way to think about what it is that we do and why we do it. This is the world we have. We're not going back. This is our challenge. This year, the Ecological Society of America celebrated its 101st year of existence. It was established in 1915, and their meeting was in Fort Lauderdale last month. Let me see if I can do this right. And their focus was this idea of novel ecosystems. Novel ecosystems in the Anthropocene. So ecologists, some would argue, are finally really engaging the fact that the most important ecological force on our planet is us. So I apologize I couldn't tell until I got here that my plagiarizing of these two figures from Hobbs et al.'s text in 2013 came across kind of crappy. I'll try to talk you through it. The graph on the left-hand side tries to introduce their concept of the ecosystems that we're finding across the planet now. So on the x-axis, it reads abiotic conditions going from similar to more dissimilar. That's here. And then on the y-axis is biological composition, again going from similar to more dissimilar. And they introduced this idea of thinking about ecosystems in three categories, which is really a continuum. Historical ecosystems, hybrid ecosystems, and novel ecosystems that the planet hasn't seen before. And one of the points that they try to make is this idea that as historical ecosystems are transitioning into these hybrid ecosystems, they have the opportunity to be pushed back into what they were as a historical state. But once we get them over into this place of novel ecosystems where they're so different in terms of abiotic conditions or biotic composition, there's no going back. Okay, that sounds a little bit ominous, but in this other diagram, now the x-axis represents similar to dissimilar biotic and abiotic composition, and the y-axis is similar to dissimilar function. So there's two things, or maybe three things going on in this particular graph. Historical, hybrid, novel. And in all of these conceptions of the types of ecosystems that we're looking at, when you have a particular suite of biotic and abiotic conditions, you have a limited type of ecological function. And the idea that you can have a very different function with the same species and abiotic factors just doesn't exist on the planet. Although this non-existence shifts as you go to these more novel ecosystems. We can create things that are doing wildly different stuff. And again, we've got this idea that we could manage hybrid systems to push them back into historical conditions when their ecological function is not meeting the needs we have. But they're also suggesting that we might accept some hybrid systems that are doing what we want and managing for them to stay here. And in the situations where we've created these novel ecosystems that we can't put back into here, maybe what our goal should be is to manage them towards particular ecological function as opposed to particular biotic and abiotic structure. All right, all of this theoretical construct really embraces this reality that we're living in a changing world. Of course, this has always been true, so let's jump back 25 centuries. None of Heraclitus' work has survived, but I like the idea of putting some Greek in one of my talks. So up at the top is a quote from Plato's Cratylus. And it's been translated, and the other quotes that are there about Heraclitus has been translated in a number of different ways. No man ever steps in the same river twice. You could not step twice into the same river, for the waters are ever flowing onto you. All entities move, and nothing remains still. Nothing is permanent except change. So let's jump ahead 2,450 years to Ramon Margalef. Here's a way that Margalef represented the way he saw change in ecological systems. Again, the x-axis here could represent whatever it is that you're trying to measure in an ecosystem. It might be a biotic or abiotic component or context. It might be some ecological function. The same thing with the y-axis, that ecosystems often exist in some fluctuation of those factors, and then periodically they're displaced to some other place, and then they go through a process of recovery back to where they were before. But Margalef, building on the work of Frederick Clements and his wife Edith, suggested that in sometimes we do things or things happen to ecosystems so out of evolutionary history that they get displaced out of this ability to repair to someplace new and different. This is really Hobbes et al.'s ideas about historic, hybrid recovering and novel ecosystems that are going someplace else. I don't know if I can juggle all this or not. When I'm teaching this concept, I use this physical metaphor for what I'm talking about of a bowl. So if you can imagine the bowl like this, and the bottom of the bowl is that quasi-stable state that a lot of our ecosystems are in. The ecosystem's just bouncing around in the bottom of a bowl. And that every once in a while something happens to that ecosystem, and it's displaced up onto the wall. But all of those forces that evolutionary time has given us return the ball back down to the bottom. Unless the nature of the disturbance in terms of frequency, intensity, or type is so different, then the ball gets displaced out of the bowl, and it goes someplace that we don't know where it's going. And I'd argue from the work that I've done that often the things that humans do to landscapes knock balls out of the bowl, because they're just not things that the ecosystems have experienced through evolutionary time. Now, which to maybe torture this metaphor too far, this bowl is moving through some kind of ecological space, like it's floating down a river. I made this graph. I'm kind of proud of it. You guys could steal it if it's up online. If you picture the land that you manage at the mouth of a river, you never step into that river twice because of everything that's being added to that river upstream. The landscape context, the changing expectations from the community, the exotic species that are being added to your mix, the altered hydrology, the historical alteration of patterns of disturbances like fire, the natural selection that's happening all the time on our ecosystems, and the climate change that we're all experiencing. Richard Hobbs, in his presentation at ESA, talking about his book, used a different metaphor that I really liked. He said, it's like we're in a riptide. So do you guys ever feel that way? The land that you're trying to manage, you're caught in this tide. Okay, what do we know about how to handle swimming in a riptide? You don't swim against it. You got to swim sideways. And probably, if in terms of managing our land, we're trying to swim back to the beach against that riptide, that beach isn't there anymore. So let's look at some of those tides of change. One of the branches of that changing river that I put up was exotic species. I don't need to tell you guys. We're going to continue to have this challenge. God, I heard on NPR yesterday, capybaras in Central Florida, established breeding population. In addition to the frogs, the snakes, the mammals that we're going to continue to deal with, and all the different kinds of plants that get introduced into our landscape, increasingly we're looking at impacts from exotic fungi, soil bacteria, and viruses that are coming from someplace else. Yeah, the job is going to be hard. It's not going to get any easier. And you guys have probably all adjusted to the fact that we're really not going to eradicate stuff. We're going to have to figure out how to control it. And we're going to be moving our ecosystems into these hybrid and novel systems as more species get added to the landscape. At the same time, our systems are more susceptible to new invasion because of the direct activities of humans in and around it and because of the stress that's being imposed by climate change. And in the Exotic Species Management Conference that's been running for about 10 years in South Florida, the last few years at FGCU, I think it was about 5 years ago that I heard Mike Berry first use the phrase triage. Are we, do you, have you already been dealing with the idea that some species you're not even going to be able to control and some places you're not even going to be able to put back to that historic condition? I think that's the reality as we face the challenges of the declining resources for doing the things we need to do. We all know that fire regimes have changed in complex ways in terms of frequency, intensity, and seasonality, and probably most of you face inadequate resources to be able to use fire like you want to and think you should, and increasing community pressure against doing what we think we need to do to be able to control the land. I'd like to say this in terms of this context of thinking about change on the landscape. If you're trying to put your ecosystems back into the fire pattern that they had in the past, that might be unnecessary and might be inappropriate. Remember, the ecosystems that you're dealing with are rolling around in the bottom of this bowl that's floating down the river. And if you're trying to apply fire to them the way that they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, that might not be what they need anymore. They're in a different place. So the real challenge is trying to figure out how fire will get your ecosystem to the place it needs to be. Same, I think, is true of hydrology. Like fire, it's changed in a whole bunch of complicated ways. Maybe the good news about this is that we seem to be learning from some of our mistakes. We're evolving best management practices in terms of managing our water. We're putting in more efforts toward restoration. I'm reading those words that I wrote down, and I'm thinking about what's happening at Lake Okeechobee, and I'm thinking, whoa, yeah, no. I have a desperate optimism that we're learning from our mistakes. Again, I think we don't want to look at the pieces of land that we're managing and saying, what did the water look like 50 years ago on this land? We've got to figure out how we adjust to the changes that have happened and how restoring hydrology, maybe restoration is, how managing hydrology will get those systems to the place we need. What do you need? How are you going to get it? And we're all existing in this landscape of climate change. Carbon dioxide levels are going up, temperature is increasing and becoming more variable, sea level is rising, hydrology is changing in complex ways. It appears that we're getting increased variability and an increased frequency of extreme events. I think I can say with great confidence all of that is true. I can also say that still too many people are ignoring that reality. And we're going to have to deal with the fact that if we could stop carbon emissions of all kinds today, these changes would continue to happen for a significant amount of time. And we really have to have more conversation about what are we going to do in response to the climate change that is happening and will continue to happen, not just how can we stop it. So let's think about what that might look like. In addition to climate continuing to change, development's going to continue to change on our landscape. I again hope that as we're looking at the way we put people on the land, that there's increased opportunities for associated preserves within those developments. And I would love to talk with some of you during the day if you think the next sentence I say is wrong. I think the most endangered habitats we have in our landscape are uplands. And so we focused a lot of energy on preserving wetlands. And maybe as we go forward with these increased opportunities, we should be looking at creating uplands, even in places where they weren't historically, because we need more uplands. Something to think about within that context. Wow, I really did talk too much. I'm looking at my time, and it's just clicking down. Oh, but you said I had an extra 5 minutes. Did you put it on here? Yes. Toby and Victor and I were just talking about this. I think the greater society has got an increasing support for environmental laws and for preserving green space. But I don't know. Sometimes I think maybe I'm just in a ivory tower preaching to choirs. I think it's getting better. But at the same time, we've got this continued, I used to say a swing of the pendulum between smaller government and less taxes over to the other side. But that pendulum hasn't swung much in Florida for over a decade. We're kind of pegged over here, right? Less is always more. But people forget that you don't get what you don't pay for. And maybe we should be talking about that a little bit. You know, we've got in Lee County the reaffirmation of the 2020 referendum coming up this November. And I really hope that we're successful in that. There is a real increasing, I don't remember why I wrote misunderstanding of the value of preserved lands. There's an increasing focus, we see it a lot in terms of the water releases from Lake Okeechobee, of understanding the economic impacts of the way we're managing our landscapes. I think there's increasing opportunities for connecting that more directly to human health, not indirectly through money, what green space gives us in terms of our state of mind, our blood pressure. And then, maybe only to the choir. I don't know if this speaks to the other people. I think we want to step back once in a while and say it's not always all about money. Again, Leopold said, the land is a community is the basic concept of ecology. And I'd add now of economics. But that land is to be loved and respected is an extension of ethics. I think that's something we all should remember and try to keep as part of the conversation. Okay, so takeaway messages about this emerging ideas in ecology and philosophy. I think first, we want to be really careful if what's driving our management decisions is the idea of returning the ecosystems to what they were. I think we won't get there. We're swimming against the tide. We want to figure out what those lands need to be, and we want to figure out how to get them there. One of the keys, I think, to dealing with that reality, and particularly the reality of climate change, is, again, going back to Leopold, to keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. We do have to focus our energy on maximizing biological diversity, and we probably have to accept the fact that that suite of species in our landscape is going to include things that weren't there when Columbus arrived. That's going to be part of the dynamic and the mix that we're going to manage. But I also want us to think about biological diversity on those other ecological levels. We've got to think about what habitats we have on our land and maximizing those. We've got to think about conductivity across the landscape. As climate changes and species move around, we want to make space for them to be able to move around. And then I've talked a couple of times about the challenges of what you guys do in terms of not having enough support and enough resources to do it. And this third piece is another drain on your resources, but I want to really encourage you to think about that in the context of the land management that you do. The lands that you're managing are in places in the bowl, and the bowl is in a place in an ecological context that in most places it's never been before. So the way we used to manage things may not be right anymore. And the only way we can unravel that complicated puzzle is to continue to have a real humble approach to what we think we're doing and put as much energy as we can bleed out of those reducing budgets to measuring, did the thing I just did move me where I wanted to go? Did this removal of an exotic have the impact that I wanted? Did this controlled burn get me to where I wanted to do? And figuring out ways of being able to measure that as we go forward. So sometimes I hear the definition of ecology as quantifying what we already know. And finally, the ecologists in North America are catching up with the idea that the most important force shaping ecosystems are humans. Yeah, big surprise. We're finding out what's happening, and it's going to be up to you guys to determine what to do about it, particularly in terms of managed lands. Your hands are on and in our ecosystems. I imagine you too often feel that crushing, awesome responsibility. I hope you also see it as an opportunity. One of my undergrads, Arlo Simmons, at a couple of Earth Days ago, just came out with this phrase. I love it. He said, "We still live in the Garden of Eden. We just have to replant it." I think that's a cool way to think about it. And as you guys go forward with this really tough job you're doing, I hope you also find opportunities within it to find some joy. Thank you all for your work. I think she's given me more time than I deserve, but I do have time for a question. Yes? Yes, the question was, I need to repeat it so it gets caught on the audio. I'm going to paraphrase. We're always speaking to the choir. How do we get politicians to things like this? I wish I had a good answer for this. I don't know. One of the things I teach in my classes is shooting and using video. And I think we may not be able to get somebody directly to a meeting like this, but I think as you guys are doing your work, the more you can explore capturing the complexity of what you do, particularly I'll add this, particularly the success of what you do. In short videos you can get online and share with people. That might encourage the conversation. So I'll add this other philosophical piece. I don't know how many of you guys are older than me. We sort of lived through that time of the late 60s into the beginning of the environmental movement. And a lot of the beginning of the movement was tied to waking people up by scaring them. I personally feel those days are over. I think those nerves are dead. I think the way you'll wake people up, particularly politicians, is not to say, look how bad it is, it's going to get worse, but to give them some hope for success, to fight against despair, and say, look at what we can do that will make things better. So the best answer I got, try to use some film as a way to reach out, but try to make the message a positive one of a hopeful future. I think that's good for all of us.